Hello all, and welcome to the second of the topic lectures for today on the dangers of life in the city. In our first lecture, City Life, we looked at the sorts of things you could see happening on the Roman streets. Here, we're going to talk about some of the dangers that this city life posed to people of all classes. So first, let's talk about fires. Fires were one of the most common hazards in Rome. Most of the buildings were wooden, and only homes/houses had proper kitchens. This meant that cooking was done over open flames. This meant that people living in apartment buildings, which had no kitchens, often cooked via a fire kindled on the floor of their apartment or in improvised stoves. Light was provided through olive oil lamps and were easily knocked over. In addition, the streets were narrow and there were no effective firefighting techniques, so once a fire started, it spread quickly. According to literature, a serious fire happened almost every night. Larger fires that destroyed entire neighborhoods happened every other year. Because this was such a problem, vigiles or firefighters were established by Augustus. Augustus's vigiles were 7,000 watchmen who patrolled the city at night, carrying buckets and attempting to extinguish any fires before they could spread. Their presence in the streets at night may have served as a deterrent for crime as well. Their equipment consisted of buckets, ladders, axes, and some sort of siphon device for spraying water. The most destructive fire of all was the Great Fire of 64 CE. It began near the Circus Maximus and rapidly spread to other areas of the city. It raged for 6 days, after which it appeared to have been brought under control, but then it broke out again and burned for another 3 days. Thus, it burned for 9 days total. By the time it was all over, 10 of Rome's 14 districts had been severely damaged, with 3 completely leveled. After this fire, the city was rebuilt with wider streets and using more fireproof materials. However, these efforts do not seem to have really curbed the frequency of fires, although they maybe helped inhibit their spread a little bit. In addition to fires, flooding was also a problem. So the factors that made rivers good for civilization also made cities near them vulnerable to devastation caused by floods. Although Rome had hills, between the hills and the valleys were originally swampy marshland. The Tiber is a turbulent river and routinely flooded when swollen by rain or snowmelt. Therefore, we have accounts of over 36 major floods between 414 BCE and 400 CE. Any flood that brought the level of, so the Tiber usually stands at 5 to 7 meters above sea level. Any flood that brought the level of the river above 13 meters would have inundated nearly all the low-lying regions of the city, including the Campus Martius, the Roman Forum, the Valley of the Circus Maximus, the Emporium District, and the Trans-Tiberum. This included every major political, commercial, and entertainment district and building in the city. Floods also lasted just a week at times before the Tiber returned to normal level, meaning that people would have to get around the city by boat. Modern data suggests that the average flood lasted 5 days with 2 to 3 days of high water. Almost all the recorded floods happened in the winter and spring, when the Tiber becomes swollen by the winter rainy season and spring snowmelt. These major floods had a lot of effects on daily life. So they're split into 2 types of effects, immediate and long-term. The most obvious immediate effect of floods would be the disruption of city life. The low-lying areas of Rome would probably have been inundated by several meters of water, making travel impossible. At least 5 accounts note that it was necessary to travel through the streets in boats. The floodwaters would also damage personal property. So any property in regions reached by the waters would have been destroyed, damaged, or lost. While some of this may have been due to water damage, the biggest problem was actually caused by the force of the water, which would have swept through the buildings and streets, carrying away everything in them. The most dramatic immediate effect would have been the spectacular collapse of large buildings. Monuments are usually built solidly, but the rickety wood structures of high-rise apartments would have been a huge problem, like they were for fires. There are numerous sources attesting to the shoddy construction techniques of these 7 or 8 story tall apartment buildings erected by slumlords. These precarious structures often collapsed of their own accord, and the stresses placed on them by floodwaters would certainly have brought many toppling down. And the final immediate consequence of flooding was the loss of life due to drowning, exposure, and trauma from objects being tossed around the flood water. However, when floodwaters receded, this was not the end of the city's problems. One very unpleasant side effect is that floodwaters leave behind a viscous and foul-smelling layer of mud and debris. This isn't mentioned specifically in any sources, but inferred from modern comparanda. For example, in 1966, Florence flooded, and the flood left behind 600,000 tons of stinking mud coating everything. Sometimes a building that was only damaged in the initial flood would then collapse due to the damage later. Buildings constructed out of bricks were singled out as being particularly susceptible due to floods. Most of the city's food and grain supply could also be affected. The city's grain supply was often stored along the riverbank since it was unloaded there. Rome had enough problems keeping its grain moisture and therefore fungus-free, normally due to humidity, so the flooding of the warehouses along the Tiber would mean the complete loss of all grain that was reached by the water. And finally, floods cause disease in multiple different ways. Those suffering due to food shortages or famine would have lowered resistance to illness. Those who lost their shelter would be more susceptible to infection and pestilence. Due to the common practice of dumping one's excrement in the streets, waste would spread throughout the flooded areas, contaminating everything it touched and rendering the water in the city unfit for drinking. The water would also cause the drains and sewers to back up into buildings. Any food not destroyed outright would have been contaminated by this filth, sickening whoever ate it. Finally, the corpses of humans and animal victims of the flood would have added to this contamination and disease. Rome did not receive reliable protection from floods until the flood of 1870 prompted the government to construct the current set of high embankments, which reach about 18 meters above sea level along both sides of the river. Since then, there have been no destructive floods in the city. The disease and general trash problems mentioned in this flooding lead us to talk about sanitation. The streets of Rome were a breeding ground for numerous disease-causing organisms due to the widespread presence of human and animal cadavers in various states of decomposition, as well as the copious amounts of raw sewage deposited in the streets. The normal course of events produced enormous amounts of dead bodies, many of which were not properly disposed of. The poor, along with Rome's large population of homeless and beggars, simply lay down where they dropped or were thrown out into the Tiber or into the open pits outside the city. Although Rome did have some sewers, their purpose was more to provide drainage than to carry waste away. While latrines were sometimes present in buildings, houses, and apartment buildings, most often they were not, suggesting that people relieved themselves in the streets or in chamber pots. Unfortunately, most city inhabitants appear to have emptied their chamber pots simply by dumping them out of the windows of their dwellings. Roman law offers an insight into sanitation living conditions through the laws that attempted to regulate what was obviously a common practice, pouring feces and garbage from one's own window into the streets. Finally, this garbage and excrement that was on the roadways would have been trampled together along with mud and the refuse to form a layer of sludge coating the street surface. The continual flow of water from street-side fountains and basins like the one on your screen may have washed this waste into the sewers to some extent, but it would also have covered the surface of the streets with a perpetually moist and unpleasant muck. This is why Juvenal's account of his trip through the streets, Harvey number 150, he says that his legs, not merely his feet, become entirely splattered with mud. This lack of sanitation then led to disease. There were many types of diseases that were prominent in ancient Rome. Malnutrition and the lack of varied diet would have caused diseases such as scurvy, pellagra, beriberi, and rickets. The poor levels of sanitation would have encouraged many other diseases as well. The unsanitary conditions made 4 groups of diseases very common. The first are enteric viruses. which are caused by the fecal-oral route, either by person-to-person contact or by ingestion of contaminated food or water. This includes diseases such as rotavirus and parvovirus. The most common health hazard posed by these viruses is gastroenteritis. Some enteroviruses also cause meningitis, which could cause blindness, brain damage, and death. Also in this category was the virus causing hepatitis A, which produces fever, lack of energy, vomiting, and jaundice that can last for weeks. The second most frequent cause of disease was bacteria from feces. These included E. coli, which causes diarrhea, salmonella, that bacteria you think of when you think of food poisoning from undercooked chicken, which causes not only gastrointestinal problems, but can sometimes invade the respiratory, cardiovascular, and nervous systems. More serious than these is typhoid fever, which causes fever, discomfort, diarrhea, and can damage the spleen and intestines. The fecal matter in the water and on the streets and in the food supply would also cause the transmission of parasites like Giardia. These would produce even more gastrointestinal issues. The final group of diseases from lack of sanitation are parasitic worms like hookworms and tapeworms. While the majority of these parasitic worms are usually not fatal to their hosts, their presence can result in a variety of health problems and substantially weaken infected individuals, making them more susceptible to other diseases. Rome's location near swampy ground and the low-lying areas of the city itself would have offered fertile breeding grounds for mosquitoes, and with mosquitoes comes malaria. While malaria is usually not fatal, bouts are often lengthy and debilitating, and those stricken suffer recurrent episodes of fever and sickness. The inhabitants of the ancient world formed strong associations between marshes and diseases, but they said it was due to bad air, not insects. The disease was a serious problem, whose victims may have included people like Julius Caesar and Augustus. Malaria seems to have been a major health threat that killed large numbers of the city's inhabitants outright and weakened many more, leaving them susceptible to other diseases. Studies of the seasonality of deaths in the city of ancient Rome reveal a strong peak in mortality between August and October, which probably correlates to malaria season. There was one perk to this whole thing, was that the water supply was usually not affected. This means that we don't have high incidences of cholera / no recorded incidences of cholera, unlike other cities with bad water supply issues. The nature of Rome's water supply system may have actually made the ancient city resistant and resilient because it was not vulnerable to contamination due to unsanitary conditions, and if it was contaminated somehow, it recovered quickly. The continual flow nature of Rome's water supply system would have ensured that contaminants did not linger in the pipes and basins, but were instead flushed out fairly rapidly and prevented from settling in standing pools of water within the system. In addition, the majority of water did not originate locally, but was transported a considerable distance to the city by aqueducts. Most of these aqueducts brought water directly from springs located on high ground up in the foothills of the Apennines. These water sources would have been completely unaffected by local disasters such as floods, so their water would have remained pure and uncontaminated. However, there was also a downside to all this water. As we'll learn in the city project and later in the semester, the Roman daily routine included a trip to the public baths. The frequency of bathing has led some to argue that the Romans were healthy. However, while bathing may have helped them keep free of dirt, it probably did not improve their overall health, since the standard prescription for those suffering from diseases was to go soak in the baths. The warm waters there would have provided an ideal environment for transmitting diseases to the other bathers. Celsus records that he advised his patients suffering from skin disease, boils, rabies, tuberculosis, fevers, diarrhea, and parasitic worms all to go soak in the baths frequently. And finally, not something mentioned in your book, but the fact that Romans had unprotected sex with multiple partners meant that they have definitely had some STIs. We have on record in doctors' treatises gonorrhea and genital and anal warts. Finally, the streets were just full of crime. The city was dangerous. There was no police force, so preventing and punishing crime was a do-it-yourself system. Individuals had to protect themselves and their property. For example, the earliest law code, the 12 Tables, said that if a thief broke into your house at night or was armed, you were allowed to kill the thief. Although if the break-in was during the day and the thief was unarmed, you were supposed to summon your neighbors to apprehend them. The streets were also hotspots for crime, especially at night. At night, the streets were considered particularly dangerous due to muggers. Wealthy men returning home from their dinner parties made sure they were accompanied by a retinue of slaves with torches and often weapons. In this do-it-yourself crime and punishment system, spontaneous mob violence seems to have been permitted, or at least ignored, and was seen as a way of settling particularly egregious disputes. There are multiple instances of people being torn to pieces by an angry mob if they were generally thought to have been guilty of some offensive crime. During the Empire, the situation in the city changed a bit due to the establishment of several military and paramilitary groups stationed within the city limits. These included the Praetorian Guard, whose primary function was to protect the emperor, the urban cohorts, and the Weigelays, who fought fires. While the presence of all these groups may have had some deterrent effect on crimes, and while they were used to keep order and suppress riots at public events, none of them was specifically charged with the prevention, detection, or investigation of ordinary crime. We do, however, have in the Law Digests a number of lawsuits preserved. And these lawsuits can tell us a lot about the sorts of things that happened on the Roman street. So, first of all, people and animals would just be randomly killed, because we have instances of if you killed someone else's slave or animal, you had to pay the highest value that the property possessed in the past year. Property was often burnt, broken, and smashed due to the fact that there are many lawsuits stating that if you burnt, broke, or smashed anything, you had to pay its highest value in the last month. Theft was also rampant, and in lawsuits, the wronged party received double the value of the object stolen. If the theft was accompanied by violence, the victim received 4 times the value. There were also just brawls and random violence. There were many lawsuits of this sort. For example, for personal injuries such as one person hitting another, an estimate was made of the damage, and the money was given to the injured person. This type of crime had a 1-year statute of limitations, meaning that if you did not bring your suit within 1 year, you could no longer do so. There were 4 cases in which the injured party got extra money because of the outrageousness of the crime. The first is if the injured person was of high rank, such as a senator. The second was if the act was unusually brutal, such as a clubbing with a heavy stick. The third was if the crime took place in a very public place, like the theater. And the fourth was if the injured body part was a particularly sensitive place, like an eye. As I mentioned before, in the City Life lecture, we have lots of lawsuits based on items being thrown out of windows. In fact, it is one of the most frequent sources of lawsuits. In such cases, the punishment was a fine amounting to 2 times the loss or damage incurred. And finally, animals would be roaming the streets. And so there's the possibility of either a domestic or wild animal attacking you. In lawsuits, if a domesticated animal caused harm or injury, the owner was liable. If a wild animal escaped and caused harm or damage, the owner was not punished as long as he had not shown negligence, since the assumption was that the animal was just being true to its wild nature.